General Vorthak stood on the bridge of his massive ship and looked down at the small blue planet below him, and his eyes glowed red with satisfaction, because this would be conquest number 18 for his Crimson Fleet, and he had never failed. To take what he wanted from any world he visited, and Earth looked so peaceful and defenseless that he almost felt sorry for the creatures living there, but not sorry enough to change his mind about what he was going to do to them. His ship was called Bloodclaw, and it was bigger than most space stations, and carried enough weapons to destroy entire moons, and around it floated nearly 3,000 other ships of his fleet, and each one was filled with his warriors who had helped him conquer 17 different star systems and turn their people into slaves and their worlds into mining colonies for his empire. And today, Earth would join that list, whether its people wanted to or not. Vorthak was 8 feet tall, and his body was covered in natural armor that had grown from his own skin over the centuries, and his forearms could crush steel, and his mandibles could bite through almost anything, and he had lived for over 400 years, and spent most of that time fighting and winning wars against species that thought they were strong until they met him and his fleet and learned what real strength looked like when it came to destroy everything they loved. On Earth, far below, President Minho sat in a room called the Oval Office and watched the alien ship hanging in the sky above his planet like a dark cloud that promised storms and death. And he had been president for 6 years, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when an alien army appeared in his sky and demanded that his entire species surrender to them or die. And he wondered if this was how it would all end for humanity after thousands of years of history. The message came through on every communication device on Earth at the same time, and Vorthak appeared as a hologram in the room where President Minho sat with his advisors. And the alien general looked even more terrifying in person than he had in the intelligence reports. And when he spoke, his voice was like metal scraping against stone, and his words were translated by machines. But the threat in them needed no translation at all. Director Kyung sat at the table next to President Minho and watched the alien general with the calm expression of someone who had spent his entire career preparing for impossible situations, and he had read every file they had on Vorthak and his methods, and he knew that this creature had destroyed entire civilizations without showing any mercy to the children or elderly or anyone else who could not fight back against his armies. Admiral Daeho stood near the wall, and his uniform was perfectly clean, and his face showed no emotion, but his hands were clasped behind his back, and his fingers were moving in patterns that only his closest officers would recognize as the hand signals he used when he was planning something that would surprise everyone in the room, including the enemies who thought they knew what humans were capable of doing when they were threatened. Colonel Jiwon sat across from Director Kyung, and she looked like a normal human woman except for her eyes, which held the kind of coldness that came from years of doing things that most people could never imagine doing, and she had trained soldiers who could appear and disappear like ghosts and kill enemies without making any sound. And she was thinking about how many ways she could make General Vorthak regret coming to Earth. General Vorthak spoke to the humans through the hologram, and his words were simple and direct because he had given this same speech 17 times before, and it had always worked, and he told them that they had 72 hours to surrender half of everything they owned and give him 10,000 of their people to work as slaves and accept that his empire now owned their world and everyone on it. The alien general explained that if they refused his generous offer, then he would destroy every city on their planet and kill every human except for the few he would keep alive to serve as examples to other species who might think about refusing his demands, and he had done this before to worlds that said no to him, and he would do it again without hesitation, because mercy was a weakness that got conquerors. Killed President Minho listened to every word, and his face remained calm, but inside his mind he was remembering stories his grandfather had told him about wars that humans had fought against impossible odds and won because they refused to give. up even when everything looked hopeless, and he wondered if General Vorthak had any idea what kind of species he had just threatened with extinction. Director Kyung made notes on a tablet, and each note was a code that would be sent to different departments around the world, and each department would begin doing things that had been planned for decades in case this exact situation ever happened, and most humans had no idea these plans existed, but the people who needed to know had been training for this day since they were children. Admiral Deho touched his earpiece and spoke quietly into his microphone, and somewhere in space invisible to alien sensors, human ships began moving into positions they had held in secret for years. And their crews had been born in space and raised to fight wars that most people hoped would never happen. But they were ready anyway because that was what humans did when they faced extinction. Colonel Ji-won smiled for the first time since the aliens had arrived, and it was not a pleasant smile because she was thinking about teams of soldiers who had been waiting in hidden places throughout the solar system for orders to begin operations that would teach alien invaders why smart species avoided fighting humans whenever possible, and why the few who tried usually regretted it very quickly. General Vorthak finished his speech and told the humans that he would return in exactly 72 hours for their answer, and he expected them to be ready to surrender everything to him, because resistance was pointless when he had 3,000 ships and they had nothing that could threaten him, and he cut the transmission. Feeling confident that he would soon add Earth to his list of conquered worlds, President Minho looked around the room at his advisors and saw determination in their eyes instead of fear, and he realized that General Vorthak had made a serious mistake by assuming that humans were like the other species he had conquered, and that they would simply give up when faced with overwhelming force, because the alien general clearly had never studied human history very carefully. The room was quiet for several minutes after the hologram disappeared, and everyone was thinking about what they had just heard and what it meant for every person living on Earth and what they would need to do in the next 72 hours to make sure that General Vorthak learned something about humans that no one had bothered to teach him before he came to their world director. Kyung spoke first, and his voice was steady as he told the others that intelligence reports showed Vorthak had never faced serious resistance from any of the species he had conquered because most of them had been peaceful civilizations with small defense forces and limited military experience, and none of them had been humans who had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war. Admiral Deho reported that long-range sensors were tracking the alien fleet, and their positions were exactly where the defense plans had predicted they would be, and human ships were already moving to surround them without being detected, and the aliens had no idea they were about to discover what happened. When someone threatened a species that had turned warfare into a science, Colonel Ji-won added that her teams were ready to begin infiltration operations that would place human soldiers inside alien ships within hours, and these soldiers had trained for years to operate in alien environments and use alien technology against its owners, and General Vorthak would soon learn that humans were very good at appearing where enemies least expected. Then President Minho stood up and walked to the window and looked up at the alien ship hanging in the sky above his capital city, and he thought about all the humans who had died fighting for freedom throughout history, and he knew that they would not want their descendants to surrender to aliens who demanded slavery and tribute from a free people. He turned back to his advisors and told them to begin implementation of Defense Protocol 7, which was a plan that had been developed over decades by the brightest military minds on Earth, and most humans had never heard of it, but it was designed specifically to deal with exactly this type of threat from exactly this type of enemy. The meeting ended, and each person left to begin their part of the response to General Vorthak and his demands. And none of them were worried about the outcome because they knew something that the alien general did not know, which was that humans had been preparing for this war long before he had ever heard of Earth, and they were ready to show him why threatening. Humanity was the last mistake many species ever made. 71 hours had passed since General Vorthak had given his ultimatum to Earth, and he sat on his command throne feeling pleased with himself because in all his previous conquests, the species he threatened had either surrendered immediately or sent desperate messages begging for mercy and offering to negotiate better terms, but humans had sent nothing at all, which meant they were probably too frightened to even respond. His bridge crew moved quietly around their stations and checked their weapon systems and prepared for what they expected would be a brief battle against primitive Earth ships before they began the process of enslaving the human population and stripping their planet of everything valuable, and General Vorthak had already decided which human cities he would destroy first to make examples for the others. The communication officer approached his throne and informed him that Earth was sending a transmission, and General Vorthak nodded with satisfaction because he had been wondering when the humans would finally accept reality and beg him for mercy, and he ordered the message to be displayed on the main screen so his entire bridge crew could watch the human leaders grovel before his power president Minho appeared on the screen, and he was sitting calmly in what looked like an ordinary office, and his expression was relaxed and pleasant as if he were about to discuss something completely normal instead of the surrender of his entire species, and General Vorthak felt slightly confused because this was not how terrified leaders usually looked when they were about to lose everything. The human president spoke in a clear voice and thanked General Vorthak for his message and said that Earth had carefully considered his offer and discussed it thoroughly with all the appropriate government departments and military advisors, and after extensive deliberation, they had reached a unanimous decision about his generous proposal to spare their lives in exchange for slavery and tribute. General Vorthak leaned forward on his throne because he wanted to hear every word of the human surrender, and he was already planning how he would divide their world among his fleet commanders, and which human cities would become industrial centers for his empire, and which populations would be most useful as slave labor for his mining operations on other worlds. President Minho continued speaking in the same calm tone and explained that Earth appreciated the time and effort that General Vorthak had spent traveling to their system and presenting his terms, but unfortunately they would have to respectfully decline his offer, because giving away half their resources and 10,000 of their people was not acceptable to the human government or the human people. The alien general felt his mandibles click in confusion because no species had ever declined his offers before, and he wondered if the humans had misunderstood his message or if their translation systems had malfunctioned, because surely no intelligent species would choose death over the chance to serve his empire and continue existing as his slaves. The human president went on to explain that Earth had a counteroffer for General Vorthak and his fleet, and they were willing to give him 12 hours to withdraw all his ships beyond the edge of their solar system and return to wherever he had come from, and if he accepted this generous offer, then no harm would come to him or his forces. General Vorthak stood up from his throne so quickly that his bridge crew stepped backward because they had never seen their commander look so shocked and confused, and he stared at the screen where this impossible human was making demands instead of begging for mercy, and for the first time in 400 years of conquest, he did not know what to say. President Minho smiled slightly and added that if General Vorthak chose not to accept their counteroffer, then Earth would be forced to demonstrate why 16 different galactic civilizations had standing orders for their military forces to avoid human space whenever possible, and why several major species had treaties specifically designed to prevent conflicts with humanity. The alien general found his voice and told the human that he commanded nearly 3,000 ships and 40,000 trained warriors, and Earth appeared to have fewer than 100 ships and no significant military forces, and the human was clearly insane if he thought he could make threats against the Crimson Fleet and expect to survive the consequences. Admiral Dai-Ho stepped into view beside President Minho, and his uniform was clean and professional, and his expression was completely serious as he corrected General Vorthak about the size of his fleet and informed him that Earth Intelligence Services had counted exactly 2,847 ships in the Crimson Fleet, and his flagship carried 12,000 crew members, and his personal guard consisted of 48 elite warriors. The alien general felt his exoskeleton begin to itch with nervousness because those numbers were exactly correct, and no one outside his own command staff should have known such precise details about his forces, and he wondered how these humans had obtained classified information about his fleet composition and troop numbers. Admiral Deho continued by explaining that Earth had also analyzed General Vorthak's tactical preferences and discovered that he favored overwhelming attacks against civilian populations while avoiding direct confrontation with organized military forces, and that his 17 previous conquests had been achieved by threatening defenseless species rather than defeating actual armies. Colonel Jiwon appeared on the other side of President Minho, and she looked directly at General Vorthak with eyes that seemed to see right through his armor and into his soul, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, but somehow more threatening than his own battle roars had ever been, and she told him that his preference for easy targets was about to end. The human colonel explained that every military academy in the galaxy taught courses about General Vorthak as an example of how not to conduct military operations and how his tactics only worked against species that had never developed serious defense capabilities, and how real soldiers considered him a bully who picked on civilians because he was too cowardly to fight. Actual warriors, General Vorthak felt rage building in his chest, but underneath the anger was something he had not experienced in centuries, which was genuine fear because these humans were not acting like any species he had ever encountered, and they seemed to know things about him that even his own officers did not know, and they were treating him like he was the one who should be afraid. President Minho spoke again, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper as he told General Vorthak that Earth intelligence had apparently failed to include certain important information in their briefing about humanity, and he was going to share some facts that might help the alien general understand his current situation more clearly. The human president explained that Earth was the species that had spent thousands of years fighting wars against each other and had developed military technology and tactics that most galactic civilizations could not even comprehend, and they had turned warfare into an art form and survival into an instinct, and they considered mutual destruction to be an acceptable military strategy. President Minho added that humans were the race that looked at hostile alien invasions and turned them into entertainment because they found the idea of alien conquest so amusing that they made movies and books and games about defeating alien invaders, and they had been preparing for this exact scenario for decades. The transmission ended, and General Vorthak found himself staring at a blank screen while his bridge crew waited for orders, and he realized that for the first time in his long career as a conqueror, he had no idea what to do next because everything about this situation was different from anything he had experienced before. His sensor officer reported that energy signatures were appearing throughout the solar system, and ship contacts were registering on long-range scanners, and the numbers kept climbing as more and more human vessels decloaked from positions that had been invisible to Crimson Fleet sensors, and the total count was rising past anything their intelligence had predicted. The tactical officer announced that human ships were not just appearing near Earth, but were positioned throughout the entire system, including behind asteroids and gas giant moons, and even in the outer reaches near the edge of interstellar space, and they had apparently been hiding there for hours or possibly days waiting for this moment. General Vorthak sat back down on his throne and tried to process what he was seeing on his tactical displays, because the humans had not built a fleet to defend themselves after his arrival, but had already possessed a massive military force that they had kept hidden until they chose to reveal it, and this meant everything his scouts had told him about Earth was wrong. His communication officer reported that they were receiving identification signals from human ships, and the computer was having difficulty classifying the vessel types because the technology appeared to be at least 2 generations ahead of anything in the Crimson Fleet database, and some of the energy signatures indicated weapons systems that his scientists had never seen before. The fleet intelligence officer approached his throne with a tablet full of data and explained that preliminary analysis suggested the human fleet consisted of approximately 4,000 Ships, and many of them were showing wear patterns and maintenance records that indicated they had been in service for decades, which meant Earth had been quietly building and maintaining this Force 4. General Vorthak stood before his tactical display and watched the impossible numbers continue to climb as more human ships appeared from hiding places throughout the solar system, and his sensor officers kept reporting new contacts in locations where their scouts had detected nothing during their initial reconnaissance, and he began to understand that humanity had made his entire intelligence network look like amateurs. The human fleet was not hiding behind their planet, as he had expected, but was spread throughout their entire star system in a formation that suggested they had been planning this engagement for years, and every ship was positioned to maximize tactical advantage and minimize his fleet's ability to escape or regroup. And he realized he was looking at the work of military strategists who understood warfare better than he did. His communications officer reported that human signals were being detected from within the Crimson Fleet itself, and security teams were finding evidence of infiltration aboard multiple ships, and General Vorthak felt his exoskeleton crack under stress because the idea that humans had somehow penetrated his fleet's security was more terrifying than facing their ships in open combat security. Chief Nexal appeared on his command screen, looking confused and frightened, as he reported that intruders had been detected aboard 17 different ships in the fleet, but none of the security systems had registered any breaches, and there were no signs of forced entry or equipment malfunctions, and the humans had apparently materialized inside sealed vessels without triggering any alarms. The alien general demanded an explanation for how primitive humans could have bypassed Crimson Fleet security technology that had been developed over centuries of warfare and had never been defeated by any species they had encountered, but Security Chief Nexal could only shake his head and admit that he had no idea how it had been accomplished on. Earth Admiral Deho stood in the command center of Cheyenne Mountain and watched holographic displays showing the positions of both fleets, while Captain Sunny provided tactical updates and highlighted enemy formations with practiced efficiency. And her calm professional demeanor suggested that surrounding an alien invasion fleet was just another day at the office for human military personnel. Captain Sunny reported that the Crimson Fleet was maintaining defensive positions around their flagship, but showed signs of confusion and uncertainty, and their formations were sloppy and uncoordinated, which indicated that their command structure was not functioning properly, and they were probably receiving conflicting orders from panicked officers. Admiral Deho nodded and turned to Colonel Jiwon, who was coordinating with infiltration teams aboard alien vessels, and her expression showed the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were working exactly as intended. And she had the look of a predator who had successfully cornered her. Colonel Jiwon reported that Operation Nightmare was proceeding according to schedule, and teams led by Majors Taeyong, Hieri, and Jaewon were in position aboard 3 separate Crimson Fleet vessels and had been there for 6 hours without being detected, and were ready to begin the next phase of their mission whenever Admiral Deho gave the order. The human officers had not been surprised by the alien invasion because Earth intelligence services had been tracking General Vorthak's movements for months and had predicted his arrival within a 3-day window, and human forces had been in position and ready to respond before the Crimson Fleet had even entered the solar system. Major Taeyong reported from aboard the alien heavy cruiser Deathstrike that his team had gained control of the ship's engine systems and could disable the vessel at any time, and the alien crew remained completely unaware of their presence, because human stealth technology was far more advanced than anything the Crimson Fleet had ever encountered. Major Hieri transmitted from the battleship Iron Maw that her team had compromised the ship's internal communications and security systems and could monitor all transmissions between alien vessels, and had already gathered valuable intelligence about Crimson Fleet command protocols and tactical procedures. Major Jaewon's team had achieved complete control of the destroyer Bloodfang and had secured the entire vessel without alerting any other ships in the fleet, and the alien crew was now restrained in the mess hall and appeared to be grateful that the humans were treating them humanely instead of killing them, as they had expected. General Vorthak received reports from his ship commanders about the infiltrations and realized that if humans could capture his vessels without being detected, then they could have done far worse things than simply taking control of ship systems, and the fact that they were showing restraint was somehow more terrifying than if they had begun killing his crews immediately. The alien general began to understand that humans were not the primitive species his intelligence reports had described, but were instead a highly advanced military civilization that had been deliberately concealing their true capabilities from the rest of the galaxy, and they had allowed him to believe they were weak while they prepared to demonstrate just how wrong he had been. His tactical officer reported that human ships were moving into attack formations with a precision and coordination that indicated extensive training and experience, and their movements followed patterns that suggested they had studied Crimson Fleet tactics and had developed specific countermeasures for every maneuver his commanders might attempt. Admiral Deho watched the alien fleet's confused response to human movements and noted that General Vorthak's commanders were trying to implement standard defensive formations but were failing to coordinate properly because their communication systems were being disrupted by human infiltration teams, and their command structure was breaking down under pressure. Colonel Jiwan reported that psychological analysis of intercepted alien communications indicated that Crimson Fleet morale was collapsing rapidly as crew members realized they were facing an enemy that could appear anywhere at any time and could control their own ships better than they could, and many alien soldiers were beginning to question whether their general had made a terrible mistake. The human infiltration teams were not just gathering intelligence and taking control of ship systems, but were also demonstrating to alien crews that humanity possessed capabilities that made resistance pointless, and that cooperation with human forces was the only reasonable option. For soldiers who wanted to survive the encounter, General Vorthak tried to contact his fleet commanders to coordinate a response, but discovered that many of his communication channels were being monitored or controlled by human infiltrators, and he could no longer be certain that his orders were reaching his ships, or that the responses he received were actually coming from his own officers. He realized that humans had not just surrounded his fleet with superior numbers and technology, but had also infiltrated and compromised his command structure and were systematically dismantling his ability to control his own forces. And he was beginning to understand why galactic civilizations avoided conflicts with humanity. The alien general had spent 400 years conquering species that fought conventional battles with conventional tactics. But humans appeared to have no interest in fighting fair or following established rules of warfare, and instead used every possible advantage, including stealth, deception, infiltration, and psychological warfare to achieve victory with minimal casualties. His intelligence officer reported that analysis of human fleet movements suggested they were not planning a direct assault, but were instead positioning their forces to cut off all possible escape routes and force the Crimson Fleet into a position where surrender would be the only alternative to complete destruction. General Vorthak looked at his tactical display and saw that his fleet was completely surrounded by human ships that appeared and disappeared at will, and his own vessels were being controlled by human infiltrators, and his communication systems were compromised, and he realized that the battle was already over, even though no shots had been fired. He had made the fundamental error of assuming that technological superiority and numerical advantage guaranteed victory, but humans had demonstrated that superior strategy, better intelligence, and more effective use of available resources could overcome any material disadvantage, and he was facing an enemy that fought smarter rather than harder. The alien general began to compose a message of surrender because he understood that continuing to resist would only result in the needless deaths of his soldiers and the complete destruction of his fleet, and he had finally encountered a species that was more dangerous than he was and had taught him what it felt like to be completely outmatched. But before he could send his surrender message, he received another transmission from Earth, and President Minho appeared on his screen again with the same calm expression and the same pleasant tone, and told him that the time for negotiation had passed and humanity was no longer interested in accepting his surrender. The human president explained that General Vorthak had made his intentions clear when he threatened to destroy human cities and enslave human populations, and Earth had decided that someone who made such threats could not be trusted to honor any agreement and would need to face the consequences of his actions. General Vorthak made the decision that would seal his fate and the fate of his entire fleet when he ordered all ships to advance on Earth because his pride would not allow him to retreat without striking at least one blow against the humans who had dared to humiliate him, and he convinced himself that superior numbers would overcome human trickery once the real fighting began. The alien general broadcast his attack order to every ship in his fleet and told his commanders to show these upstart humans what happened to species that refused to submit to the Crimson Fleet, and he was confident that overwhelming firepower would crush human resistance and prove that his reputation as a conqueror was well-deserved. His fleet began moving toward Earth in the same formation that had terrified 17 different species into immediate surrender, but General Vorthak did not realize that he was about to face an enemy that had studied his tactics for years and had developed specific countermeasures for exactly this type of assault. The human response was immediate and devastating, but it was nothing like the conventional space battle that General Vorthak had expected because humans did not meet his fleet in honorable formation or engage in the type of direct confrontation that had characterized his previous conquests, and instead they fought like the guerrilla warriors their species had always been. Human ships appeared from behind asteroids and struck with precision, before vanishing again into the void, and they used the solar system's gravity wells and radiation fields and debris clouds as weapons and cover, and they turned the entire star system into a battlefield that favored their tactics over his captain. Isol commanded the stealth destroyer Shadow of Soul and led a pack of similar vessels in surgical strikes against the flanks of the Crimson Fleet formation, and her ships moved like wolves hunting a herd of prey animals, and they picked off isolated targets before disappearing back into the darkness of space. Her tactical philosophy was simple and effective because she hit enemy ships where they were not expecting attack and hit them hard enough to disable or destroy them and was gone before they could respond or call for help, and this approach had been developed through centuries of human warfare against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Dongyun served as weapons officer aboard the Shadow of Soul, and when Captain Isol ordered him to target the command cruiser Ravager, he fired a full spread of antimatter torpedoes that turned the alien vessel into a brief star that lit up the entire battlefield before fading back to darkness. The destruction of the Ravager sent shockwaves through the Crimson Fleet because it had been one of their most powerful ships, and its loss meant that an entire section of their formation was suddenly without coordination or leadership, and human ships immediately exploited this weakness with more targeted strikes. General Vorthak watched in growing horror as his carefully planned assault began falling apart under human pack tactics, and he realized that these were not the desperate attacks of a cornered primitive species, but the systematic dismantling of his fleet by experienced predators who knew exactly what they were doing. Commander Nari led a squadron of assault frigates in attacks that demonstrated humanity's approach to space combat, and she reminded her crews that they were not trying to win a fair fight, but were trying to end the battle as quickly and efficiently as possible and should use every advantage available to them. The human commander told her pilots to remember that their enemies still thought humans were primitive, and to use that misconception, along with their superior stealth technology and better sensors and more effective training to achieve victory with minimal losses to their own forces. What terrified General Vorthak most about the human attacks was not the destruction they caused, but the precision with which they were executed, because human forces targeted command vessels and communication arrays and formation leaders with surgical accuracy that suggested they understood Crimson Fleet organization better than some of his own officers. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that knew exactly which ships to destroy, to cripple their coordination, and which targets to avoid because they were not militarily significant. and humans wasted no effort on meaningless destruction, but focused entirely on achieving strategic objectives with maximum efficiency. Human tactics were unlike anything General Vorthak had encountered in 4 centuries of warfare because they did not try to match his fleet ship for ship or engage in the type of direct confrontation that most species considered honorable, but instead used superior intelligence and strategy to avoid fair fights whenever possible. The battle became a demonstration of why experienced military strategists throughout the galaxy warned against fighting humans because they approached warfare as a science rather than an art, and they had spent thousands of years developing tactics specifically designed to defeat larger and more powerful enemies. Captain Hyunwoo commanded the heavy cruiser Busan Thunder, and his ship served as a command vessel for human forces in the outer system, and he coordinated attacks by dozens of smaller vessels that struck at the Crimson Fleet like a swarm of angry insects and disappeared before the aliens could retaliate effectively. His tactical display showed the systematic destruction of alien formations as human forces exploited every weakness in Crimson Fleet organization. And he noted with professional satisfaction that the battle was proceeding exactly according to the plans that Earth strategists had developed based on analysis of General Vorthak's previous campaigns. Lieutenant Colonel Sunho led fighter squadrons that darted between larger ships and disabled alien vessels by targeting specific systems rather than trying to destroy them completely, and his pilots had trained for years to operate in the chaotic environment of a space battle, and they moved with the precision of dancers. The human fighters used their superior speed and maneuverability to avoid alien weapons while delivering precise strikes against engine systems and weapon mounts and command centers, and they turned the space around, the Crimson Fleet, into a deadly maze where alien ships could not move without being attacked from unexpected directions. General Vorthak tried to rally his remaining forces by broadcasting inspirational messages about the glory of conquest and the shame of defeat. But his words rang hollow, because his officers could see the tactical situation clearly and understood that they were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that was far more skilled than they were. The alien generals' formation dissolved into chaos as individual ship commanders began making their own decisions about whether to continue fighting or attempt to escape, and many of them discovered that human forces had anticipated their retreat routes and positioned ships to intercept anyone who tried to flee the battle. Major Yunji commanded a squadron of interceptor craft that had been positioned specifically to prevent Crimson Fleet ships from escaping the solar system, and her pilots had orders to disable rather than destroy fleeing vessels because Earth wanted prisoners for interrogation and evidence of human restraint in victory. The human interceptors used advanced weapons that could disable alien ships without killing their crews, and this technology had been developed specifically for situations where Earth needed to capture rather than destroy enemy forces, and it demonstrated that humans planned for victory rather than just hoping for survival by the end of the battle half of the Crimson Fleet had been disabled or destroyed while human forces had lost fewer than a dozen ships, and most of those losses had been caused by accidents rather than enemy action, and the disparity in casualties made it clear that this had not been a battle, but a massacre. The surviving alien ships found themselves surrounded by human vessels and completely unable to continue fighting or escape from the solar system, and their crews were demoralized and confused because they had never experienced such a complete defeat, and many of them were beginning to surrender individually. General Vorthak sat on his command throne and stared at the tactical display showing the wreckage of his once mighty fleet, and he finally understood that he had made the same mistake that had destroyed so many other military commanders throughout galactic history, which was underestimating his enemy. He opened a communication channel to Earth, and his voice was barely a whisper as he told President Minho that the Crimson Fleet yielded, and that his victory was complete, and he requested permission to withdraw his surviving ships from human space and promised never to return to threaten Earth again. President Minho's response was swift and final, and his words made it clear that withdrawal was no longer an option because General Vorthak had threatened Earth and attacked human forces and endangered innocent people, and the time for mercy had ended when he opened fire on ships that had been trying to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The human president explained that Earth could not allow someone who had threatened genocide to simply leave and continue threatening other species, and that General Vorthak and his remaining forces would be taken into custody and held accountable for their actions according to interstellar law. What happened next became the story that changed how every species in the galaxy thought about humanity, because General Vorthak and his surviving fleet were not destroyed or enslaved, but were instead captured and treated according to interstellar law, and this demonstration of restraint combined with overwhelming military capability created a legend that spread to every corner of known space. Colonel Ji-Wan oversaw the processing of alien prisoners aboard the massive human carrier Incheon, and she made sure that every captured soldier received medical attention and proper food and housing according to established protocols. And this confused the aliens more than any torture could have, because they had expected humans to treat them the way they had treated their own victims. The alien prisoners could not understand why humans were following rules of war when they had the power to do whatever they wanted to their defeated enemies, and many of them asked their guards why they were not being killed or enslaved, and the human soldiers explained that civilized species did not murder prisoners or torture the defeated captain. Minsu served as the intelligence officer who conducted interrogations of captured aliens, and he was patient and professional as he gathered information about Crimson Fleet operations and General Vorthak's previous conquests, and he treated even the most hostile prisoners with respect and dignity. During his interrogation, General Vorthak asked Captain Minsu why humans were not killing their prisoners, and the human officer looked genuinely confused by the question and explained that killing surrendered enemies violated every military code that Earth forces followed and was considered a war crime that could result in imprisonment for human soldiers. The alien general could not comprehend this concept because, in his experience, the strong did whatever they wanted to. The weak and mercy was a luxury that only the foolish could afford, and he had never encountered a species that combined overwhelming military power with moral restraint, and the combination terrified him more than death would have. Through careful interrogation, Captain Minsu and his team learned the truth about General Vorthak's 17 conquests and discovered that the alien general had achieved his victories through terror and massacre and had never actually faced serious military resistance from any of the species he had defeated. The human interrogators learned that Vorthak's standard procedure was to target civilian populations with overwhelming force and threaten to destroy entire worlds unless military forces surrendered immediately, and most species had chosen to submit rather than watch their children and elderly be murdered by alien invaders. This information explained why General Vorthak had been so confident about conquering Earth and why he had been so shocked when humans refused to surrender and instead fought back with superior tactics and technology, and it also explained why his fleet had collapsed so quickly when faced with actual military opposition. President Minho decided to address the entire galaxy through a broadcast that would be transmitted from every major communication relay in human space, and he stood beside Admiral Deho and Colonel Jiwan as he prepared to deliver humanity's message to civilizations throughout the known universe. The human president began by announcing that Earth had successfully defended itself against the Crimson Fleet, and that General Vorthak and his surviving forces were now prisoners of war who would be held according to interstellar law and would eventually be returned to their home systems for trial by their own. People President Minho explained that Earth did not seek conquest or empire, but would defend itself against any threat, and he made it clear that humanity possessed both the capability and the will to protect their world and their people from anyone who tried to harm them. The human president continued by noting that this event should serve as notice to any other species that might be considering attacks against Earth, and he warned that humanity had spent centuries preparing for exactly this type of threat and had built fleets and trained soldiers specifically to defend against invasion. President Minho told the galaxy that humans were not the primitive isolated species that some believed them to be, but were instead a civilization that had turned warfare into a science and diplomacy into an art, and had spent thousands of years learning how to survive against impossible odds. He explained that humanity was the species that had fought themselves for millennia and had emerged stronger from every conflict, and had studied every military engagement in galactic history, and had learned from every tactical innovation, and had prepared for every possible threat. The broadcast included footage of human ships escorting the remnants of the Crimson Fleet to the edge of the solar system, and this final demonstration showed that Earth possessed both the power to destroy their enemies and the wisdom to show mercy when victory was complete. Within a standard galactic year, the story had spread to every inhabited system and had grown in the telling until it became the legend of how humans had responded to demands for tribute with a promise to slay their enemies, and had then proved they could deliver on that promise while maintaining their principles. The tale became a cautionary story that parents told their children about what happened when someone threatened a species that looked peaceful but was actually the most dangerous predator in the galaxy, and it changed how every civilization thought about humanity and their place among the stars. General Vorthak became a figure of ridicule rather than fear, and his name was used as an example of what happened to bullies who picked fights with opponents they did not understand, and his defeat marked the end of the Crimson Fleet as a threat to anyone in the galaxy. Meanwhile, humanity's reputation shifted from primitive backwater species to sleeping giants that were better left undisturbed, and the phrase, "We'll slay you idiots," became famous throughout the galaxy as an example of how humans responded to threats against their world ambassador Wu Jin of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, began receiving formal requests for mutual defense treaties from species that had previously ignored Earth, and it seemed that the galaxy had decided that humanity made much better allies than enemies, and that cooperation was preferable to conflict. The age of testing Earth's resolve had ended, and the age of respecting humanity's place among the stars had begun, and species throughout the galaxy learned that humans were not the weak primitives they appeared to be, but were instead a civilization that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war. Director Kyung filed reports in the deepest archives of human intelligence about 37 other potential threats that were currently moving through nearby sectors, and each of these threats was now receiving updated assessments based on humanity's demonstrated capabilities. The intelligence reports noted that the best way to avoid a fight was to ensure that potential enemies knew exactly what kind of fight they would be starting if they threatened Earth, and that humanity's reputation as a species to be avoided was far more effective than any weapon 6 months after the defeat of the Crimson Fleet. Ambassador Wu Jin received the first of many formal requests for mutual defense treaties and trade agreements and scientific exchanges, and it became clear that the galaxy had decided that humanity was a valuable ally rather than a dangerous enemy. The human diplomatic corps found themselves busier than they had ever been, as species throughout the galaxy sought to establish friendly relations with Earth and to benefit from human technology and military expertise, and to ensure that they would never find themselves on the wrong side of a conflict with humanity. Captain Iseul was promoted to admiral and given command of the new galactic patrol fleet that would work with other species to maintain peace and stability throughout their region of space. And her reputation as the commander who had destroyed the Ravager made her famous among human and alien military. Officers Colonel Jiwan established the Terran Special Operations Academy, where soldiers from allied species could train alongside human forces and learn the tactics and strategies that had made Earth's military so effective, and this became one of the most prestigious military schools in the galaxy. The defeat of General Vorthak and the Crimson Fleet became the foundation of humanity's reputation as a species that combined overwhelming military capability with moral restraint and strategic wisdom, and this reputation served Earth well in the years that followed, as they took their place as one of the major powers in galactic civilization. The story ended not with conquest or destruction, but with the establishment of humanity as a respected member of the galactic community, and proof that sometimes the best way to achieve peace was to demonstrate that you were too dangerous to attack and too valuable to ignore.